Hello to all my SUPA students. This is your Chapter 23 lecture as we move into new instruction during the April 2020 school closure due to the coronavirus. This is the first lecture I'm providing online, and it's essentially on Chapter 23 and the Roaring Twenties. In your Google Classroom, you will have access to the PowerPoint for this so you can follow along to the slides as I lecture. Just to be clear, I'm going to break this lecture into two YouTube videos. The first one is going to cover slides 1 through 7, and it's going to deal with mostly the unique social aspects of the Roaring Twenties. And then the second part of the lecture will go from slides 8 to the conclusion, getting more into the economic and political aspects of the 1920s, which you should have covered in your Chapter 23 reading. So with that all said, let's start with the lecture on Chapter 23. So I'm going to jump, I'm actually going to start with slide 1. Slide 1 calls, the Roaring Twenties. And you think, why is the 1920s considered the Roaring Twenties? It's because it was a time of massive change and upheaval. It wasn't necessarily, calm and still and pristine. It was a time period of massive social change. There's a lot of similarities one can make between the 1920s and present day, and we'll do it as we move through this lecture. So, moving on to slide 2, which I entitled Legislating on Morality. And simply put, this was the decade of really America's first drug war. It was a decade of the only full decade of prohibition, where alcohol is illegal. And I think that we know just from the world that we live in, just because you make something illegal, it just doesn't stop its usage. So, with the 18th Amendment, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol becomes illegal, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't stop people from doing it. You essentially move that crime underground, you create organized crime around it. The key figure who's symbolic of that is, Al Capone, with bootlegging and speakeasies, which are essentially like underground bars. They are almost like the equivalent of like a heroin den today, or like a crack house, if one were really to think about it. In today's day and age, we have illegal narcotics. At this point, alcohol was really that first illegal drug. It was a very difficult law to enforce. People flaunted it, and society was divided on it. Throughout the course, we've been talking about the difference between wets and dries. So it's not the first time that seeing alcohol illegal, was discussed in American politics. And it's kind of like, some of the laws today. Like, think about laws that are difficult to enforce. Like texting and driving is one. It's a law that many people do. It's not safe. It's not good, but people do it anyway. It's a difficult law to enforce. How do you monitor what people are doing in their cars? And it's the same thing, with the way alcohol was in the 1920s. Moving on to slide 3. Let's talk about, women breaking all the rules, which is the title of this here. The flapper is the symbol of the 1920s woman who, basically starts to break social norms. Women really step out and start doing the same thing that men do. Smoking cigarettes, drinking, being sexually aggressive, assertive, flaunting their sexuality, being more competitive in nature. These were things that went against the traditional trend, and it's not a surprise that in the 1920s you see the emergence of these flappers per se, because if you think about it, at this point women were voting, so politically they experienced quite the change, and economically many of them were involved in the workforce. So it's not a shocker that women broke the social norms as well. Like I said, and I put this in the slide, this whole idea that the majority of women in the 20s were flappers, that's a myth, but the flapper has become the symbol of that new 1920s woman. Moving on to slide 4, going to the movies, and this is really like where I like to draw a lot of parallels. Even let's go back to the last 2 slides. If you think about it, say the America's first drug war with prohibition. Today you have the war against narcotics, and you have organized crime running narcotics. If you look at women, the emancipated women in the 1920s. Think back to 2016. You had 2 women running for president, and Hillary Clinton as a Democrat, and Jill Stein is a candidate of the Green Party. So with that said, The 1920s is kind of like the beginning of modern America. And now let's think about the movies. What were the movies? The movies were a cheap escape for people, to get out. And this would continue during the Great Depression, which we're going to cover in the next unit. And it's really the emergence of Hollywood. So when we think about it, it also, the movie celebrated things that traditional fundamental America didn't essentially agree with. Things like sexual themes, the celebration of youth, athleticism, consumerism, and I mean just think about where that's risen to today. They have T-shirts for movies. They have toys based on movies. It's only expanded and snowballed into something so much bigger. And in rural areas, people kind of looked at that as this is a little over the top. And it's kind of like today, if you look at, urban culture versus rural culture. Urban culture is typically a little bit more liberal and open-minded, and rural culture is usually a little bit more conservative. So that trend hasn't really changed. Also, if you think about it, movies today, think about what celebrities are making. I challenge you to go and look at, who is the top grossing U.S. actor for 2019? Who made the most money in Hollywood? Essentially, you have actors getting paid millions of dollars to entertain us and play make pretend. That's kind of where we're at. And that continues when we move to slide 5. Slide 5, we're going to look at the radio, another new medium and form of entertainment here. This is how people got information. People got information via the radio. Like today, we get it via our smartphones. It was the new technology of the generation. By 1923, I have this here on your slide, 600 radio stations have been licensed. In today's day and age, it's been much more, the radio has obviously been hurting. But you don't have as many independent private radio stations. But what does the radio provide? Music, educational lectures, church services, news, weather, entertainment. It was arguably the smartphone of its era. Once again, similarities between the 1920s. This is just a form of cultural shift in the way people live, and we can relate to it if you think about the way we live today. You might have the older generation not understanding why kids are so enthralled by their smartphones and apps and social networking. What do you think old people were saying to younger people in the 20s when women were breaking those social norms? Movies, people being glued to the radio. They were probably looking at them like, why are you living this way? They didn't understand it because it was a time of change. Moving on to slide 6, the automobile. So let's look at a couple aspects of the automobile. Henry Ford. Some people mistake Henry Ford invented the automobile. No, Henry Ford made the automobile affordable. It was because of his assembly line. Integrating integrated parts into the assembly line process. He made it where people could afford the automobile. He paid his employees a higher wage, knowing that they were going to buy his cars and give his money right back to him. And what happens is in the 1920s, by the end of that decade, there were over 4 million cars added to the roads. And Ford typically gets credit for that. He did face competition. You saw companies like Chevy and Cadillac who would divide the market. Cadillac would be the first, kind of like market brand, upscale. It's like, if you think about it today, what's really the difference between a Chevy, a GMC, and a Cadillac? For the most part, they're all the same engines, the same suspension systems, and the same vehicles. The Cadillac just has a higher target market. They're marketing to those who have more money. It's more a sign of affluence. And this all really started to revolutionize in the 1920s. And you look how reliant we are upon cars today. That market's changing. Today we live in the day and age of you see more electric being used and more cars being more fuel efficient. A couple other things you got to think. Well, how does the car impact the American economy? Rubber, glass, fuel, oil, diners, hotels. Because people would travel and they need places to stay. So that kind of spins off into the rest of the economy and ultimately changes the way people live. But let's move on to our last slide, slide 7, which deals with sports and celebrity. It would be, during this era of the 1920s, and baseball would be the first big one in the United States where athletes became superstars. I mean, think about how far that's gone today. Look at people like, LeBron James, right? And, you look at people, Tiger Woods, just to name a few, Roger Federer, these athletes that make millions of dollars to essentially play games and once again entertain us. It started in the 1920s. They didn't make the money that they do now. They weren't crossing over to being actors and musicians and hosting TV shows. But if we look at it today, sport and celebrity, and the fact that they drew millions of people to games, it became a form of entertainment in urban areas. And it's like if you look at your pro sports today, where they center, they're not centered in areas of rural upstate New York. They're centered in your major urban centers right across the Northeast, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, just to name a couple. So I want to stop there, and I hope this gives you a pretty good understanding of the first 7 slides and really, just the changing culture of the 1920s. Tomorrow we'll delve more into the economic and the political aspects of the 1920s, which were also roaring. Most importantly, I hope this finds all you guys in good health during this really unique time period. And please email me with any questions or concerns.